And today we're going to talk about three just enormous trends, two sort of like historical level trends, and one very meaningful for 2024 trends that are really shaping planned giving. And why does this matter? Because the trends that are facing and shaping planned giving are really shaping philanthropy at an enormous level. And so we're really glad to have you here today. And we will dive right in. We have a lot to cover today. We're going to go through this relatively quickly. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to add them along the way. A couple of housekeeping notes. We'll go through this part quickly. One, this event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. At the end of the session, we're going to drop a survey in the chat. Please make sure you fill that out. It's also very helpful to us. So do that. Here's the agenda. Big note is that these slides and the recording will be sent around later today, so you can look out for that. One thing that a lot of people do after this is there's a particularly interesting portion that they want to share with their colleagues. They might share it and say, you know, I thought the portion from minute 24 to 26 or whatever is valuable. And so you can do that as well. Quick intros. My name is Patrick, lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill, alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny, who's pictured here. She's obviously the shorter one. And we're really lucky to work alongside a big, diverse team that has raised almost $10 billion with a capital B for charity. We have almost 1,600 nonprofit partners, including many of you. If that's you, special thank you. And we have a lot of experience, and we put that to use thinking about what's happening in the world and what ought we to do about it. And so lots of cool stuff there. We are also, speaking of gratitude, just incredibly grateful for you and that you're here really pushing your career forward, pushing your team forward, pushing your organization forward. And so we are going to send at least 20 of you a gift. We would send more of you a gift, but we would spend all of our money sending books to people if we did that. So we don't. But we are sending a copy of Nudge. This is one of the most important books in modern economics. And it's one of the most important books we think in philanthropy, even though it's not actually about charitable giving. Right? And this book about Nudge is how do small shifts radically change behavior of individuals, whether it's purchasing decisions or life decisions, or in our case, giving decisions. Super important. Don't take my word for it. Richard Thaler, who is one of the key, one of two authors here, has won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Cass Sunstein, a famous Harvard professor, won the Holberg Prize, which is very prestigious in the economics field. So it is a very big deal, and these folks are really smart. And when I told you a moment ago that FreeWill has generated almost $10 billion for charity, a lot of that is using some of these practices. And so take a note. It's a as economics books go, it's a surprisingly good and easy read. So how do you get that, by the way? At the end of the webinar, not now, we will drop a survey in the chat, and we will select 20 folks from that. So, and by the way, if you don't get it, it's obviously available in your local bookstore, and it's still strongly recommended. All right, so let's talk about how your week is going. Generally, you know, things are looking up pretty steady. Good news overall. So we're going to keep going. But when we ask you your thoughts on planned giving, there's some really interesting things that I want to show you. So we ask you, where are you in your planned giving journey? We know it's super important. Only about 5% of you says we have no planned giving program, but 40% say early stages, right? So we're just getting off the ground. And a lot of you know how important this is, and that's why we're really investing now. Another 35% say we have a planned giving program, but it's not a big focus. 16% of you says we actually have a, you know, all cylinders are clicking here. It's really, really working. We have this comprehensive program. And so if you're in that category, please, along the way throughout the session, any sort of notes, comments, things that have worked for you that we can share with the other 85%, that will be really useful. So please consider doing that. Now, when we ask you how high a priority is, you know, 16% of you, again, say it's a very high priority. 29% put it at a 4, and 36% at 3. So actually, so we're leaning pretty hard in terms of prioritization, but it means a lot of us are earlier in the journey there. And so if you're earlier in the journey, there's going to be a lot of things that should help you pretty dramatically, we hope, to get this up and running. I think one of the secrets about planned giving before we go forward is it's not as hard as people think. It's really, really achievable here. And so we hope you can make the most of this. When we ask you what your concerns are, right? You can see here, figuring out how to engage potential donors is one of the biggest challenges. And we'll talk about how to do that, particularly marketing communication strategies, similarly up there, getting a planned giving program started. Again, this is not as hard as you might think. Legal and regulatory compliance. There are some ways to do this with very little compliance effort. Things like measuring program effectiveness as well. So a lot of big things there. Let's talk about what's happening. We have 3 big trends. We're going to count them down in 2024. We're going to go through each of these. We'll talk about why it's happening, what it means for giving, and then in the next session, or next section, excuse me, today, we'll talk about what are the actual practical tips you would put in place here. So the first trend is that the demographics, right, the age and the time has passed, and now the Great Wealth Transfer is not simply coming, but it has arrived, the Great Wealth Transfer. So the Great Wealth Transfer is what economists and demographers talk about with this now estimated $90 trillion, 90, expected to be passed on from wealthy older generations, primarily the baby boomer population. This will be from 45 million households over 20 years, and it's expected to place, next 20 years. In 2023 and 2022, we started to see the beginnings of it. In 2024, it's really starting to happen. Let's dive in and talk about what that means. So the Great Wealth Transfer is a once-in-a-century opportunity for nonprofits. It is the most important philanthropic happening of your lifetime. Boomers hold vast amounts of personal wealth, and there are 5 distinct reasons for this. And the size of the population combined with the amount of wealth of the population is what combines into this enormous opportunity. So first one is generation size. We'll talk about how that happened. 2 is social changes. There's a lot of social changes in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s that contribute to enormous philanthropic opportunity right now. 3rd is education. 4th is housing prices. And 5th is the overall market performance over the last 60 years. And so all of this is combining into making this a really important moment for you as a fundraiser. So when we talk about baby boomers, this was the enormous population born from 1946 until 1964, right? That's how we bookend the baby boomers. They are up to 78 years old in 2024. And you can see here, right, in 20 years, the youngest will be 60 and the oldest will be 108. But right now, the oldest are 78, which is past the average life expectancy of a lot of folks. They are the 2nd largest generation in terms of overall population right now. So they're bigger than Gen Z and they're bigger than Gen X still. They used to be larger than millennials, but because folks in the boomer population, some of them have passed away, and that's much less true for millennials, although certainly some have, millennials are now the largest population in terms of generation in the United States. The boomer cohort is more than 60% larger than the silent generation, not currently, right? Currently, it's like 10 times bigger. But when it was born, it was 60% larger than the silent generation, which is really, really important. We'll talk about why that matters. They represented a larger share of the whole population at birth than Gen X or millennials or Gen Z. And the 65 plus population grew by 34% by 14 million during the past decade. And it's now about 52 million people in the United States over 65, right? 52 million. And that's so much bigger than it was even before 2010. So why did this happen? You can just look at how many people were born. This is in the millions, obviously, each year during the baby boom, which is why we call it the boom, after the silent generation, and how few people were born during that period. It's often called the baby bust, right? And so when we think about the way that we do giving, a lot of us have grown up in fundraising during the time when the silent generation was the oldest cohort. And those folks are smaller, they're less wealthy, right? There's a lot of the things that have happened to boomers didn't happen to them. And so we now have to rethink the way we do strategy based on our oldest donors now mostly being baby boomers. Here we go. Great. When we look at birth rates, right, you can see that between these ages, right, between these years of 46 to 64, you just saw an enormous number of folks having children. Why is that? World War II ends, enlisted men come home, they start having kids. There's a bunch of economic incentives that we don't have to get into right now that led people to have more and more kids. And there we go. When we look, what does that mean, right? The folks that are born in 1940 tend to pass away 75 or 80 years later. And the folks that were born in 1930, when many fewer were, also have the same trajectory. And so we look at the math over time, and you can look at 2020, 2030, 2040, and compared to, say, 1990, twice as many people pass away every year. This is just a fundamental reshift in the way that America is working, right? And the way that population is working in the United States. This is a really big thing happening, not just to philanthropy, but to all industries. It'd be really surprising to see what happens to the housing market, or interesting to see what happens in the housing market when a lot of folks are either moving out of their homes or passing away. As we think about baby boomers, right, it's not just that there's a lot of them, although that is a defining characteristic. But as a generation, they had huge social changes. They are more religious than younger generations. They are less religious than older generations. They are less educated than younger generations, but they're more religious than older generations. So when they think about their parents, they are less religious and more educated compared to their parents. They're also married more than millennials, less than silent generation, but they got married later in life compared to their parents. They had children later in life. Many of them had fewer children, which is a big deal. We'll talk about that in a moment. They got divorced more commonly, right? Divorce hit sort of social norms in a way for this generation that simply didn't happen for the previous generation. And also being single, right, isn't a sign of failure, right, the way it might have been in the 20s and 30s. And so some really interesting stuff here as well, right? And all of this led to more wage earners and dramatically more aggregate income. In particular, right, before we get into what's happening right now, a couple big things happening, right? They're more educated. What does that mean? They were getting better jobs. They were able to take advantage of productivity and globalization and other things that led to dramatically increased earners per worker. Now, what's the other really key component here? The social change part. What is the biggest part for economic purposes of social change? It was women entering the workforce, right? So it means that not only do we have a ton more people, 60% more people, but we have a lot more women in the workforce compared to the silent generation. And so you might have double the number of workers that the previous generation had. Oh, and by the way, these workers are all more educated. And so suddenly the amount of income earning in a year or in a lifetime is so much higher for this generation in aggregate than it was previously, which is why all this wealth is so important and so just massive compared to the previous generation. The real point here is we haven't seen anything like this happen before, so we need to start rethinking what we're doing. Now, one thing that is logical, but not a lot of people notice, is that women will actually control most of the great wealth transfer. In fact, over half of women age 65 are unmarried or widowed. Women on average live 6 years longer than men in the United States at the moment, right? That is a mix of, at least to the best of our understanding, a mix of biology and behavior, right? So there's some shift there. And for same-sex, that should say for opposite-sex married couples, that's a typo. For opposite-sex married couples, boomer women stand to inherit and control their husband's assets because women are living longer, but also they're getting married often to men who are a couple years older than they are on average, right? You can see this across the board in terms of opposite gender marriages from 1890 to present. It's actually interestingly stayed relatively consistent, although not totally consistent, in terms of some meaningful age gap there by a couple years, right? 2022 is about 2 years. And so you combine that 2-year marriage gap with a 6-year life expectancy, and I think there's something like 6 widows for every widower in the United States, right? And so interesting stuff. Someone asked, what are the sources, right? And you can see actually when you get the deck, you'll see footnotes for all of this. So this is from the US Census and some of the other data as well. Great. So how do they get so much wealth, right? So now we know we have a lot of folks, it's an enormous income, but there's a lot of other components here, right? Many folks who might not seem wealthy to you grew wealthy with housing prices, right? Because if you live in the Boston area, the DC area, the New York area, the San Francisco Bay Area, certainly, LA, Austin, Houston, Dallas, all these homes that might have been quite cheap when they were purchased 35 years ago, may now be worth more than $1 million. Nearly half of boomers purchased their first home between 25 and 34, compared to a pretty small percentage of millennials in the same age range. Why? Because housing got a lot more expensive. Oops, sorry, Mac does these crazy things with the camera sometimes. Housing got a lot more expensive, right? When after these folks bought a lot of houses, right? Because supply constrained and demand stayed high. So these houses are now worth exponentially more and make a really strong component of overall net worth. They've also lived through outstanding economic performance dating back to the 60s and 70s. And it's not so much that older generations are inherently wealthier, it's that they've never had so much wealth in comparison to previous generations, right? It's not that being wealthy is necessarily an immediate proxy of being older or vice versa, but this generation in particular just got extremely lucky and fortunate along the way, which leads us to the massive trend two. It is not simply the case of historical context and historical wealth building, but the last 48, 36, and 24 months have seen a dramatic increase in the assets of this generation in particular. So we talked about all the great wealth transfer, we talked about it for years. The last 2 years have pushed it to a new level. And many of you saw that $90 trillion estimate, which is a revised estimate on a previous sense of 70 trillion, which is a big gap, right? It's sort of easy to think these numbers are all so big, but suddenly 25% more giving might happen. So in the last, 3 and 2 years, it's built on this enormous acceleration of wealth over the last 3 and 4 decades, right? So boomers have benefited immensely from the stock market, also have benefited immensely from real estate prices, from stock investments, from IRA accounts. We'll talk more about that in a moment. From donor advised funds. Now, this isn't wealth, but it's other things that have assets in them, and those assets are growing quite quickly. It means a few things for planned giving, but it becomes super important, right? So just looking at us from October of 2022, and you can see S&P is over 5,000 now, and October 2022, which is not very long ago, right? We're talking about 18 months ago. It's grown about 50% in that time, right? And it's more than doubled since the low point in 2020. We're seeing just incredible growth here. October 2023, even in the last year, right? Or even the last 6 months, we've seen about 20-25% growth. So this is a really big deal because all these assets are happening, right? Real estate is owned by boomers primarily, right? 44% of real estate wealth in 2021 was held by boomers. They're empty nesters. So empty nesters own 28% of the large homes in the United States. Many of these homes are completely paid off, right? So it's a very big difference if I own a home, but mostly, the bank owns the home, or if it's paid off in terms of how much wealth I have across the board. The total value of boomers' real estate in 2023 was $18 trillion compared to just $5 trillion for millennials. $5 trillion, obviously still a lot of money, but you can see there's just, where all this wealth is just hanging out. Generational homeownership rates in 2021, you can see that boomers are the largest homeowners, right? And the highest percentage of boomers own homes compared to anything else. And so this is where the wealth is. And then single family home prices, you can see here. I mean, look at how big the shift is. And if you're buying a house for $50,000 in 1980, and now that is worth $400,000, or in some, more affluent areas, these numbers all have a big multiple on them as well. So housing has gone up incredibly. It's concentrated wealth, and it's accelerated in the last 24 months. Right? In the stock market, there's a high rate of ownership. A lot of boomers own stock. Since 2001, 60% of boomers have consistently held stock. Last year, we saw 24% gains after falling. And so far in 2024, we're at record highs, already up 6% on the year, which is generally an okay year, but it's only April. And so you're starting to see this stuff grow and grow and grow. It means a lot more highly valued stock. And as a side note, for those of you that are doing major gifts or even just big gifts from individuals, we remember that there's more appreciated assets here, meaning they're worth more than I bought them for, and those make the very best gifts, right? So we're increasingly seeing the smart fundraisers and the smart gift officers asking for stock giving all the time because it can be so powerful. Here's another thing. They're putting a lot of money in IRA accounts, and those accounts have grown with stock market performance. There's roughly $14 trillion in IRAs. According to Fidelity, they've seen an 11% year-over-year increase in IRA accounts. It's also, for those of you, again, that are skilled fundraisers, it means you've seen a rise in qualified charitable distributions. And for older boomers, QCDs will be one of the best ways to give, right? Now, many of you, again, if you've been working in the field longer, maybe you're used to QCDs not being such a big deal. Part of that is tax changes. But remember also, if we go all the way back and we talk to folks who were 65 years old in 1980 or 85 or 1990, right? Maybe our grandparents. A lot of those folks have what we call pensions. A pension is a defined benefit retirement plan, which means no matter how long you live, you get the same amount every week or every month or every year. An IRA tends to be what's called a defined contribution plan. It means you put the same amount in, but then what you get is variable, right? It's your investments and what have you. There are some ups and downs to IRAs as a retirement plan, but for philanthropy, it's much better for folks to have IRAs that they can give to you than pensions, which basically cease when that person passes away. And so some of this historical shift in things like union contracts from the 1980s are now affecting philanthropy in 2024, which is really sort of fascinating how this works. And it's why IRAs have grown so quickly. Just to give you a sense here, again, big moment in 2021 with huge stock market performance, but we are back. And we're going to break the $14 trillion barrier soon in IRAs. It's also influencing QCDs, right? So just some quick basics here. Money in your IRA account is always going to get taxed because we put that money in without paying income tax on it. And the government says, okay, do that. But when you take it out, you need to pay income tax on it. And it will always be taxed. Even if I have an IRA and I pass away and I leave it to my child, they have to pay income taxes on it, whether or not I'm above the estate tax threshold. Now, why is that? Because I never paid taxes on it in the first place. So here, what we're doing here is we're putting this in, and it means that the only way that I can avoid taxes on my IRA is to give it to charity, a 501c3 in particular, right? And this way, we allow donors to give this money and then conserve their post-tax assets. So that can be quite valuable. These are growing in popularity because every day thousands of boomers become eligible to make a QCD gift, which eligibility is at 70 and a half years old. A little confusing, 70 and a half years old. But as we build the habit for folks of making QCD gifts, they can become an annual recurring gift. And in some cases, you can actually set up a QCD to be recurring. But also, what else happens? It starts to let folks know that the IRA is a charitable giving vehicle. And so when they think about planned giving, they also begin to think about these beneficiary designations, right? David, thank you, David, says Catholic Relief Services has seen a huge increase in QCDs, and we hear a lot of folks saying that as well, right? So they're much better. They tend to be much larger gifts than cash gifts. Again, we want to steer people away from cash giving as much as possible. But we also use it as the introduction to making you a beneficiary of the IRA writ large. All right. We'll get into I see some more questions in the chat. We'll come back to that in a little bit. The other thing I want to remind folks of, those of you that have studied fundraising and philanthropy have seen the explosive rise of donor advised funds in the last decade, in the last 5 years in particular. We really think there's three massive trends happening in the world of philanthropy that are changing everything. One is the Great Wealth Transfer. Two is the rise of donor advised funds. And three is the rise of artificial intelligence and how that's going to shape fundraising workflow, right? But the DAF component actually has a role in the Great Wealth Transfer here, right? So just a quick reminder for those of you that might not be up to speed on donor advised funds. Donors put money into an investment fund with a sponsoring organization, and then they recommend grants out to the charity at a later point. The donor gets an immediate tax benefit, even if the money doesn't go to you for years. And mostly people are putting in cash, but even more so publicly traded stock, mutual funds, et cetera. In fact, about 2/3 of all assets or funds put into a donor advised fund is not cash. So the explosive, right, the explosive market performance that we talked about fueling the great wealth transfer has also fueled the rise of donor advised funds. There's more than 230 billion at last estimate, but we would say a more reasonable estimate for right now, how much money is in DAFs right now, is about $270 billion. Boomers, Gen X, millennials all have DAFs. We found a big report. We did a big report on stock giving and found that stock giving in DAFs consistently is outpacing giving to traditional nonprofits. There's so much money. But what does that mean? What about DAFs? We need to think about DAFs as another area where people can assign accounts to you upon death. And we'll talk more about that later. But if there's a whole bunch of money and somebody wants to give it out every year, but then at some point they will pass away, right? For better or worse, we are all mortal. And so we need to make sure there's a plan for that as well. And we'll cover that a little bit in not the next section where we'll talk about the third trend, but in the what to do about it section right after that. What is the third big thing happening? And this is, again, apologies, will be relatively American specific or US specific. The third major trend that's going to change planned giving this year has very little to do with planned giving, but is the presidential election and the massive federal elections are going to take an enormous amount of oxygen out of the air, out of the room, and really demand a lot of attention and shift the attitudes of folks writ large. So the research that we see is that giving doesn't change so dramatically during presidential years, although we will see what happens this year. So historically, everything sort of tends to even out, but nonprofits who are aligned with the losing party, not technically, right? You're not political organizations, but liberal nonprofits or conservative nonprofits, especially in the advocacy world. If your party loses, you tend to see an increase in giving. And if your party wins, you actually tend to see a decrease, right? People, if your party wins, right? Again, this is all loose affiliations. If you're a liberal organization and Joe Biden wins by 4 points and Democrats take the House and Senate, you'll actually probably see a little bit of a drift downwards in donations because people don't feel this urge to fight back. Now, if Trump wins and Republicans take the House and Senate, you'll see a lot more gifts. Same is true in the inverse. Conservative organization, especially advocacy or policy related, Biden and the Democrats win, you'll see a lot more gifts. If other thing happens, you'll see less. Now, if you're a museum, a hospital, unrelated, you'll probably see a relatively slight dip this year and bounce back relatively quickly. Why is that? There's just a lot of attention on other things. Charitable giving increased in 9 of the last 10 years. 2008 is the only exception. What else happened in 2008? Enormous economic crisis, and that's what drove down giving. But what happens, right, is that we're still in complicated communications world, right? 15 billion political texts were sent in 2022, about 50 messages per phone. Those of you that have been watching this year are probably getting quite a few already. The GOP is the big culprit here, 12 billion, whereas Democrats send another 3 billion. My guess is that Democrats are going to up their game this year. And so and there's no sense of GOP slowing down. So there might be 30 or 40 billion text messages sent this year. And what we want to do is overall comm strategy and overall fundraising strategy, we may want to front load some of our communications before donors get distracted. In 2024, I mean, everyone is going to be inundated, but let's just take a very quick look at the places that are going to be most inundated. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. A couple other places that are probably going to be in the mix: Minnesota, New Hampshire, right? Colorado could be. Even Nebraska's 2nd district or 3rd district. There's one Nebraska district that allocates its presidential electoral vote. On one, if you're a nonprofit in that congressional district in Nebraska, got to get your work in early here. But you might say, well, I'm in California, I'm in Maine, I'm in New York, I got it easy. And what? Well, we got some, good news, bad news for you. We have some extremely competitive Senate races that are also going to flood the airwaves and direct mail and text messages and phone calls. Montana, not a presidential swing state, pretty tough year, pretty significant knockdown, drag-out fight for the Senate and John Tester's seat. Nevada, Arizona, doubling again. Texas, big Senate race. Florida, big Senate race. Maryland, right, safe blue state. Not a safe Senate seat for Democrats this year, with Larry Hogan hopping in the race. So you're going to see a ton of messaging and money spent there. Ohio, again, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, y'all are going to get just draped in this. And of course, this doesn't just say anything about some of the Senate primaries. So you have some blue states with open seats and red states with open seats where the general election won't be very competitive, but the primary election, people in California are already seeing this with Adam Schiff and some other folks going at it for the Democratic nomination in California. And then you might think, well, maybe I'm in Washington State, I got a free ride here. Not true. Big gubernatorial races in Vermont, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Washington, among others, but these are going to be the most competitive. And so now we're seeing to see, okay, well, there's a couple, maybe I'm in Illinois, a little bit more of a free ride here, but generally there's going to be a lot of attention, a lot of ad spend, right? Your online ads are going to get more expensive. If you're doing any TV, it's going to get more expensive, obviously radio, but then getting people to pick up their phones, real problem. Getting people to open emails and text messages will be more of a problem. So we have to do some of this stuff early. We'll talk about this in a moment. This will be the most expensive election ever. $12 billion was spent on political ads, or will be spent this year. $12 billion. It's so much, right? 2/3 of the $14 billion in 2020 came from individual donations. Where the rest of it come from? Corporates, some organizations, and some self-funding by very rich candidates. And so there's a lot going on, and we're going to have to break through the noise. We'll talk about what that might look like. Americans are also likely to say this year will be a significant source of stress, in particular the presidential election. Unfortunately, political scientists and campaign strategists, who are all smart people, right, doing hard work, they have found that for the most part, negative and oppositional messaging does more to drive voter turnout and to change behavior than positive messaging. This is sort of too bad, with some rare exceptions, and you saw this maybe in the first Obama campaign, but even the Obama campaign had a ton of negative messaging about John McCain and then Mitt Romney. So you see, lots of stress happening from Democrats, from Republicans, from independents. And you can imagine in a world where you have one major presidential candidate going through a whole bunch of criminal charges, that this is not going to be a fuzzy, rosy, happy election year, right? It's just not. And so you're going to see a lot of stress building up and a lot of negative advertising from all comers, and we'll see what that looks like. And so there's an opportunity for you in this space to be what we think of as the light in the storm, right? Beyond knowing what to ask for, we'll talk about that in a second. Remember that there's a lot of stress happening for a lot of Americans, and the work you do can actually relieve some of this stress, right? Some suggestions from the American Psychological Association for Combating Election Stress includes things like getting involved in more issues that matter to you and staying socially connected, right? So in a world of so much negativity, you can imagine that having folks at the Boys and Girls Club to volunteer is going to bring people a lot of happiness and joy, on top of the impact it's obviously having on the people that they're supporting. Yes. The shift to digital, right, is the bonus trend here, right? So separate from our big three trends, the last thing we're going to talk about is that in 2012, only 13% of Americans over 65 own a smartphone. In 2021, more than 61%. It's probably more like 80% in 2024, and certainly among more affluent donors, right? It's very, very high, right? Big percentage of folks using social media. Most baby boomers are giving online, and they're now going online to do things like plan gifts or stock giving, right? So this is a big shift as well. All this stuff used to happen over coffee and in the mail, and now all these donors are going online as well. A couple of steps, right? So now we know these big trends are happening. Big trend number one, great wealth transfer, right? Just the demographics are shifting. Big trend two, an enormous shift in asset and asset growth. Big shift three, the election and all that entails. And the little bonus trend is this big shift towards technology and digital tools, replacing things that used to happen only offline. So what the heck do we do about it? We want to give you a couple of big steps, and these should be actionable and achievable. The first one is get 2 or 3 folks on your team, sit in a room, and in 30 minutes, just do a quick checkup on your own plan giving program, right? First thing, do we have clear and accessible plan giving information on our website? You should be able to answer that and see where it is. 2, when was the last time we communicated with our plan giving donors? Just give a sense, right? You don't have to do anything yet. Just say, oh, it's been, we know 10 people have left us plan gifts, or 100 or 1,000. When's the last time we said anything to them? Do we have current resources for our staff to discuss plan giving options with donors when they raise it or when we raise it? Just, yes or no, and where are you? When was our last review of our plan giving policies? What are our current goals for the plan giving program, and how do we perform against them? Do we have specific metrics for tracking the success of our plan giving efforts or not? How do we acknowledge significant plan gifts? Right? These are all things we want you to just do a quick check-in. You should be able to do it in half an hour with somebody taking notes and a few people talking. Step 2, if you haven't already, put a giant block in your calendar for August of 2024. August is National Make-A-Will Month. It is a holiday that we did not make up, but we did make it a lot bigger. And now there are thousands of charities participating every year, and it's awesome. It's a great opportunity to drive plan giving. If you have never done plan giving, you should still do this. And it's for 2 reasons. 1, August is just an easy time internally to get on your calendar. And 2, it drives an enormous amount of giving. Just to give you an idea here, look at these huge spikes, right? You see one in January, and then these really big spikes in August in terms of folks making estate plans, and how it's so much larger than any other component in the rest of the year, because August Make-A-Will Month has really, really, really taken off, right? Bequests and plan gifts are by far the largest gift of a donor's lifetime. And what we do here, right, the reason it works, the reason Make-A-Will Month works is the biggest reason people don't make an estate plan or don't make a plan gift is they think, I'll get around to it later. There's no rush, right? There's no rush is really the big hurdle you're facing. And so instead we say, look, we're all doing this together, and August is Make-A-Will Month. Do it by the end of August. There's a natural deadline, right? August 31st, get it done. And that bandwagon effect and that urgency totally changes the way that people think about it. That nudge that we talked about in the book, right? The Nobel Prize winning book, right? And suddenly you see enormous giving. And so online resources like FreeWill, can't recommend them highly enough. This is not a sales pitch for FreeWill, but it is an awesome tool. Will making kits, less good, still useful. A list of local estate planning attorneys. And we will email you what we call mom, right? Make-A-Will Month, mom toolkit after the webinar, so you can take full advantage of this. If you only do one thing in plan giving this year, this will really help you be outstanding. Here's some messaging, right? Just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Dear Aunt, this August is Make-A-Will Month, a moment we were encouraged to plan ahead and protect our loved ones by creating an estate plan. In addition to protecting those you love, I want to share one powerful way you can support your organization and your plans that will cost nothing to you during your lifetime, making a gift in your will. It's important to secure the work of our organization for years to come, and allows you to create a legacy with a cause that is close to your heart. It's very, very quick, right? Step 3, we are going big on qualified charitable distributions. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because the money is transferred from your IRA, right? We know that donors have to be 70 and a half. They're a big driver behind RMDs, which is the amount of money you have to start taking out every year from your IRA. But these are the gifts that we're talking about that are driving really big gifts from the IRAs, but also setting it up to be a large gift long-term as making you the primary beneficiary designation, right? So we've talked more about the taxes. I won't go through this right now again, but we're going to see really big beneficiary designations happening. Every time we talk to a donor over 70, we want to highlight these, and we want to promote them more widely in our marketing materials. Right now, just think what percentage of donors do I have who are over 70? And for a lot of you, it's going to be half or a third. And so if it's that high, we should just include notes about this every time we make a fundraising ask. We also saw that folks who promoted QCDs 3 times or more saw a huge boost in giving QCDs at the end of the year. So it can be quite useful. Step 4, when we have DAF donors with a donor advised fund, let's confirm that they have a plan for their funds. Many donors don't have beneficiary designations from their DAF, and if a DAF holder passes away, the funds will most likely pass to the sponsoring fund. And so here's some language you can use. One thing I've seen is that many of our donors forget to add beneficiary designations. You may already have thought of this, but just in case I wanted to raise it, would you like me to talk through some of the options? Right, this can be quite useful. Step 5, as we think about the election, the 2024 election will be the most expensive election in modern history, and a large part of this will come from small donors. Political campaigns, as you might know, can only take cash donations, with some rare exceptions. And so donor advised funds, QCDs, and bequests face no competition. There are no planned gifts going to the election. There's no stock giving going to the election. Donor advised funds are illegal to give to a political campaign. QCDs are illegal to give to a political campaign. And so when we talk about these gifts, there's no fighting with the Biden campaign, the Trump campaign, whatever Senate campaign we're talking about. And so we can really do this, right? Donor advised fund gifts in particular, these gifts are earmarked for charitable giving and can never be done with anything else. And so these are really good avenues during election years. One example of language you might use says this: we understand the importance of making every dollar count, especially during an election year when so many important causes are vying for your attention. By giving non-cash assets, you can stand out from the crowd, ensuring your contribution works harder for both you and the causes close to your heart. Many of our supporters give stock, etc. Right? And so this kind of language will help you break through when they're getting 50 donation asks that day from Democratic super PACs or Republican super PACs, etc. Now, one of the challenges here, right, especially in an election year, and I worked in political fundraising, is that you want to be good stewards of your donors and your email list, etc. And if you're a Senate campaign in a 50-50 race, right, you could win, you could lose, it could be really close. You just don't care about unsubscribes. You just don't care about donors feeling burnt out, because you've got to put everything you have into this until November 7th or whatever election day is this year, and then you're done. And so you don't have to, it's okay if everyone's sort of tired and unsubscribing and mad by the end of the election. You need every dollar you can possibly get. Meanwhile, when you're a museum who wants to live for another 100 years, right, you have to be more responsible here. And so this responsible messaging will really be helpful in making sure that donors feel cared for, when a lot of the campaigns just don't care for donors the same way because they're following their own incentives and you're following yours. As a bonus, as we get farther into the election, especially once the election happens, stick with us, right? We will be in touch all the time. And Senate control in particular will dictate tax policy. Tax policy is not built around charitable giving, but it often has enormous impacts on charitable giving, right? Say this again. Tax policy changes a lot, especially when there's political control shifts. For the most part, tax policy is not designed around how it incentivizes or disincentivizes charitable giving, and yet it does have an enormous impact on how giving happens, right? Because the incentives exist whether or not they were designed for that. And so we have Democratic control, we have Republican control, right? We have split control, we have expiring tax laws, we have other options. And what's going to happen is all of this is going to change a little bit in the way donors think about giving and how they think about giving. And so what we'll do is we will keep an eye on the election results. We will start to project out what legislation might get passed based on the new makeup of the House, the new makeup of the Senate, the inhabitant of the White House, et cetera, and give you a general sense of what could happen. And then as we track the legislation, we'll tell you a lot more likely what's definitely going to happen and what to do about it in the relatively short term as well. So stay tuned on that. And then last thing, separate from the election, is one of the things I'm most excited about in planned giving is that stewardship is hard, right? Following up with people year after year is tricky. Following up with personalized notes is hard. And artificial intelligence is going to make you a lot better at this, and your job's a lot easier, right? And as we think about stewardship, this is a really great opportunity to help use AI. We have a free tool called Willy, which you can go to at willy.freewill.com. Someone told us the other day, as a consultant, it was at AFP Icon, pulled our team aside and said, Willy is the single best thing that's ever happened to small nonprofits. Thank you, Phoebe, for putting a note in the chat. She said, the best thing that's ever happened for small nonprofits. And the reason is it took so much time off their plate, and suddenly folks are doing what they used to do slowly, more quickly, and at a higher level. Now, some of you just asked about William, right? Tracy says, isn't it now called William? Britt says, I couldn't agree. We love Willy. Michelle says, it's pretty awesome. And for FreeWill partners, and actually we're unveiling this today, I have a separate speaking event in about an hour, I think, maybe an hour and a half. And we're unveiling something called William, which is a more advanced version of Willy, right? Less juvenile, more advanced. That is where a bunch of your the best practices from your organization are built in to the tools, and it knows your tone of voice, the background of your organization, a whole bunch of other stuff. And suddenly you're writing the absolute best fundraising notes, stewardship notes, year-long strategic plans, et cetera, in seconds. And honestly, it will change your life. So hopefully many of you will who are FreeWill partners are going to come to that, because we think when you look back at this year, this stuff is going to be one of the things that makes you happiest overall. Jessica says, I was skeptical, and I love Willy. So fun, really great. Last thing I want to note about plan giving is it's really, really important here to lead with kindness, right? Whether it's an election year or not. And there's a lot of emotions behind the topics today, right? Elections, legacies, dealing with mortality is hard, right? It's the most consistent part of life, and the one we refuse to talk about, and it's hard, right? It's hard to talk about this stuff. And we really want to lead with kindness. We want to use thoughtful language in our plan giving outreach. And we've done a ton of testing, and we tried to test and experiment with kindness. And I'll just tell you what works really well from all the data that we've seen. One thing I like to say is, even if you plan to live to 150, you still need a will. Get started today. And this sort of gently reminds people that they're not infinitely immortal without, making it too serious, and that's really useful. Other thing we've seen is, supporters of the animal shelter or the land trust or whatever, from 18 to 88 choose to include us in their will or trust. Do you want info on how to join them? And really showing that it's a big welcoming tent, right, of young people and old people, et cetera, tends to be super useful. And that really makes folks feel at home as well. So encourage you to do that as well. All right, a couple quick notes, and then we will wrap up. My colleague, Carol, thanks so much. Carol says, I absolutely love these webinars and excited to raise money and secure funding. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. All right. My colleague, Phoebe, thanks, Phoebe, just put a link in the chat to the survey. Please fill it out right now if you can. And particularly, first things first, is we're going to give 20 copies of this book, Nudge, by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, award-winning economists who are brilliant. Go pick that up and read it. Make a note in the survey as well. Second, we're going to send you that Make a Will Month Success Toolkit that we talked about. I know you got a ton of stuff in today's webinar, and so this will help make it really actionable. 3, by the way, if you need CRE credits, get that in the survey as well. And then 4th, if you want to come hang out with us on Thursday in 47 hours, almost exactly, we're going to do a deep dive on some of the technology behind Make a Will Month and plan giving. And you are welcome to join that. 30 minutes, super casual, pretty fun. And that will be much more about what tools FreeWill has for you if you're interested. So that's what that is. You can, and by the way, if you want to participate in Make a Will Month, which we strongly recommend, we generally set a deadline of about June 10th to partner. So make that happen as well. All right, so that's that. Oh, and in 2 weeks, on May 7th, we are going to talk about the latest evolutions in AI for fundraising. And we're going to talk about how to put that deeply into practice in your work. I am now at a point where I probably use AI on many days 8 to 10 times to make my job better, and it's great. It's been so helpful. I had this conversation the other day with my co-founder. We said, wow, this research is so well done. Thank you so much. I can't believe how much effort you put into this. And I had to tell her I only spent 8 minutes on it. I did a bunch of AI work. I edited it myself, and it was an incredible outcome. And so that was great. But I did tell her, I was honest about it based on how great it was. So we will show you some tips and tricks in order to just take work off your plate, usually deliver better outcomes and have more fun doing it, which is a great way to live. And if you need anything at all, find me at patrick@freewill.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn, very easy to find. My last name is Schmitt, Schmitt. And with that, we're going to pause. So glad to have you all here. Thank you so much for being here. It is a wild time in fundraising. I mean, DAOs, Great Wall Transfer, AI, elections, so much happening. A lot of these are really good things for us as a sector, and so excited to sort of navigate and swim along with you all. Pretty cool times. So thank you again. Big shout out to my coworker Phoebe, who put a ton of work in here to make this happen. And we'll see many of you later today. See a lot more of you on Thursday or next week. So have a great week. Talk to you soon.